Hello, this is Toby Dunlap, OHSAA Director of Officiating Development for Wrestling. This is a first in a series of at least 2 virtual presentations that will serve as a credit for a local wrestling association meeting. The topic for this presentation concerns inbounds, out of bounds, fall and near fall criteria relative to the boundary line. This topic was briefly discussed at the OWA clinic in early November. This presentation will cover the salient points of fall and near fall criteria near the boundary line in more detail. In order to better understand the concept of how to determine whether a fall or near fall can be scored inside or beyond the boundary line, we have to review some fundamental concepts and definitions. Today's agenda will cover a review of supporting points and inbounds criteria relative to the boundary line from the neutral position, a definition of inbounds, a review of supporting points, a review of out of bounds, a review of near fall criteria, a review of supporting points when the defensive wrestler is on his or her back in a pinning situation, a review of inbounds criteria, a review of out of bounds criteria. Included at the end of this presentation are a series of National Federation illustrations that exemplify several inbounds and out of bounds near fall situations with explanations whether near fall can be scored. The illustrations are followed by a series of slides that present a number of casebook type boundary line near fall situations followed by the correct rulings. According to National Federation Rule 5.15.1, a wrestler is in bounds if a total of 2 supporting points of either wrestler are inside or on the boundary line. The 2 supporting points could be 2 supporting points of one wrestler or 1 supporting point of each wrestler. Illustration A exemplifies the positions of the supporting points of each wrestler relative to the boundary line. Since this is a perspective from the neutral standing position, the feet of each wrestler are the supporting points. While this illustration concerns supporting points in the neutral position, it will help us understand what constitutes inbounds or out of bounds in terms of how the supporting points of each wrestler are situated relative to the boundary line. In Figure 1, 2 supporting points of the red wrestler are inside the boundary line. Wrestling continues. In Figure 2, 1 supporting point of the blue wrestler and 1 supporting point of the red wrestler are inside the boundary line. Wrestling continues. In Figure 3, 1 supporting point of the blue wrestler and 1 supporting point of the red wrestler are on the boundary line. Wrestling continues. In Figure 4, 1 supporting point of the blue wrestler is on the boundary line, but no supporting points of the red wrestler are on or inside the boundary line. Wrestling is stopped for out of bounds. In Figure 5, the blue wrestler has 2 supporting points on the boundary line. Wrestling continues. Supporting points, whether on the feet in the neutral standing position or down on the mat, are defined as the parts of the body touching the wrestling area which may or may not bear the wrestler's weight, other than those parts with which the wrestler is holding the opponent. When down on the mat, the usual points of support are the knees, side of the thigh, the buttocks, the hands, and/or the head. When there are no longer a total of 2 supporting points inside or on the boundary line, the wrestlers are deemed to be out of bounds. Another important concept in understanding an inbounds or out of bounds situation is the definition of near fall criteria. For near fall to be scored, near fall criteria must be held for at least 2 seconds. The basic criteria for defining a near fall are 1. If any part of both shoulders or both scapula of the defensive wrestler are held within 4 inches of the mat or less. 2. When one shoulder or scapula of the defensive wrestler is touching the mat and the other shoulder or scapula is held at a 45-degree angle or less with the mat. And 3. When the defensive wrestler is held in a high bridge or on both elbows. National Federation Rule 515-2B is the key to understanding whether a wrestler who is on his or her back is in bounds or out of bounds. The operative phrase embodied in this rule is, quote, any part of the defensive wrestler's shoulders or scapula when touching the mat is considered to be all of the supporting points. National Federation Rule 515-2C pertains to the supporting points of the offensive wrestler. If the feet, including the toes and heels of the offensive wrestler, are the supporting points, the offensive wrestler's knees must be inside the boundary line, whether in contact or above the mat. This most likely will come into consideration when the defensive wrestler is out of bounds and held in a Peterson or headlock applied by the offensive wrestler, where the feet and knees of the offensive wrestler are initially situated inside the boundary line, and the subsequent action forces the knees of the offensive wrestler beyond the boundary line. Once this occurs, both wrestlers are considered out of bounds and the match shall be stopped. Illustration B exemplifies various near-fall situations under National Federation Rule 515-2B. In frame 1, the offensive wrestler in blue is completely out of bounds. The defensive wrestler in red has a shoulder or scapula in contact with the boundary line. That point of contact is considered to be all of the supporting points. Consequently, 2 supporting points of the defensive wrestler are in bounds and wrestling continues. Rule 515-2B. In frame 2, the offensive wrestler in blue again is completely out of bounds. The defensive wrestler in red has a shoulder or scapula in contact with the boundary line. That point of contact is considered to be all of the supporting points. Consequently, 2 supporting points of the defensive wrestler are in bounds and wrestling continues. Rule 515-2B. In frame 3, the defensive wrestler in red is completely out of bounds. However, the offensive wrestler in blue has his thigh and hip on the boundary line, constituting 2 supporting points. Wrestling continues. Rule 515-2A. In frame 4, the offensive wrestler in blue is completely out of bounds. The defensive wrestler in red is completely out of bounds except for his head, which is held in a high bridge inside the boundary line. Since there is only one supporting point of one wrestler, the head, in bounds, the action is stopped. In frame 5, the defensive wrestler in red is held in a high bridge with his feet inside the boundary line with the head posted outside of the boundary line. Note that the defensive wrestler's shoulder and scapula are elevated above the mat. Let's assume the offensive wrestler in blue is completely out of bounds. In this situation, the feet of the defensive wrestler are considered 2 supporting points, so wrestling continues. The ultimate goal in wrestling is to secure the fall. A fall occurs when any part of both shoulders or both scapula of either wrestler are in contact with the mat for 2 seconds. Remember the operative phrase of National Federation Rule 515-2B when ascertaining near fall criteria is being met, in bounds, or whether to stop the match for an out of bounds situation. Remember, any part of the defensive wrestler's shoulder or scapula is considered to be all of the supporting points. The official who masters this concept will be adept at recognizing and administering fall and near fall criteria on or beyond the boundary line in a consistent and uncapricious manner. The following series of National Federation illustrations, illustrations C, D, and E, exemplify various inbounds and out of bounds near fall scenarios built around Rule 5:15-2B. In frames 1 and 2, the offensive wrestler in blue is completely out of bounds. The pinning area, that is, the shoulder and scapula of the defensive wrestler in red, are in contact with the mat out of bounds. The shoulders and scapula become all the supporting points of the defensive wrestler and are considered out of bounds. Rule 5:15-2B. Two supporting points of one wrestler or one supporting point of each wrestler are not on or inside the boundary line. Wrestling shall be stopped. In frame 3, this is a similar situation presented in illustration B, frame 3, where the defensive wrestler in red is completely out of bounds. However, the offensive wrestler in blue has his thigh and hip, which are two supporting points, on the boundary line. Rule 5:15-2A. Wrestling continues. In illustration D, frames 1 and 2, the offensive wrestler in blue is completely out of bounds. The defensive wrestler in red is held in near fall criteria with only a portion of his shoulder or scapula in contact with the boundary line. In this situation, the shoulder or scapula become all the supporting points, and wrestling continues as two supporting points of one wrestler are in bounds. Rule 5:15-2B. Should the shoulder and scapula of the defensive wrestler come off of the mat over the boundary line, wrestling shall stop, as no supporting points of either wrestler are on or inside the boundary line. Rule 5:15-1. In illustration E, frame 1, the offensive wrestler in blue is completely out of bounds. The defensive wrestler in red has 1 foot inside the boundary line with his pinning area, that is, the shoulders and scapula, in contact with the mat out of bounds. Since any part of the defensive wrestler's shoulders or scapula is considered to be all of the supporting points, both wrestlers are out of bounds and wrestling shall be stopped. Rule 5:15-2B. In frame 2, which is a similar situation to illustration B, frame 5, the defensive wrestler in red is held on a high bridge with his feet inside the boundary line with the head posted outside of the boundary line. Note that the defensive wrestler's shoulders and scapula are elevated above the mat. Let's assume the offensive wrestler is completely out of bounds. In this situation, the feet of the defensive wrestler are considered two supporting points, so wrestling continues. Should the defensive wrestler's shoulder or scapula come in contact with the mat beyond the boundary line, Rule 5:15-2B dictates that wrestling shall be stopped. The following situations with rulings are intended to exemplify scenarios predicated on National Federation Rule 5:15-2B. Situation 1. Wrestler B is in a near fall with the pinning area, that is, the shoulders and scapulae, outside of the boundary line. In A, wrestler A has two supporting points in bounds and has a deep half Nelson with an inside crotch pinning maneuver. In B, wrestler A completes a Peterson maneuver on wrestler B with only his or her feet in bounds. The knees are situated beyond the outside of the boundary line. In C, wrestler A has a headlock with feet in bounds. Knees and feet are situated inside of the boundary line. Situation 1, rulings. In A and C, wrestling continues as two supporting points of wrestler A are in bounds. Rule 5:15-1. Near fall or fall can be earned. Note that in situation C, the feet and knees of wrestler A are inside of the boundary line. Rule 5:15-2C, and are considered in bounds. In B, wrestling is stopped once the knees of wrestler A are outside of the boundary line. Again, Rule 5:15-2C, as wrestler A has no supporting points inside of the boundary line, and wrestler B's shoulders and scapula are beyond the boundary line. Situation 2. Wrestler A has Wrestler B in a pinning situation at the edge of the mat. The shoulders of Wrestler B are touching the boundary line. The rest of Wrestler B's body is outside of the boundary line. In A, Wrestler A has one supporting point touching the boundary line. In B, Wrestler A has two supporting points inside of the boundary line. In C, Wrestler A has no supporting points touching or inside of the boundary line. Situation 2, rulings. In A, B, and C, wrestling continues. Fall or near fall can be earned as two supporting points of Wrestler B are in bounds. In this situation, any part of the defensive wrestler's shoulder or scapula is considered to be all of the supporting points, as in Rule 5:15-2B. In A, B, and C, Wrestler A's position is irrelevant. Situation 3. Wrestler B is on his or her back with both scapulae and one shoulder beyond the boundary line. A portion of Wrestler B's other shoulder is touching the boundary line. In A, Wrestler A applies a Peterson with feet and knees within the boundary line. In B, Wrestler A, off to the side, has Wrestler B in a legal headlock with Wrestler A's buttocks on the boundary line and the rest of Wrestler A's body situated outside of the boundary line. In C, Wrestler B is situated as in A, with Wrestler A's feet situated in bounds, but the knees are beyond the boundary line. Situation 3, rulings. In A, B, and C, wrestling continues. Fall and near fall may be earned by Wrestler A regardless of his or her position in bounds or out of bounds, because any part of Wrestler B's shoulder or scapula are considered to be all of the supporting points. Accordingly, two supporting points of Wrestler B are deemed to be in bounds. Situation 4. Wrestler A, with a hip and thigh on the boundary line, is holding Wrestler B in a cradle situation. Wrestler B is completely out of bounds. In A, one shoulder of Wrestler B is held on the mat. In B, both shoulders of Wrestler B are held to the mat for 2 seconds. In C, during action, the thigh of Wrestler A slides out of bounds. Situation 4, rulings. In A and B, wrestling shall continue. Fall and near fall can be earned. While Wrestler B is completely out of bounds, Wrestler A has two supporting points, the hip and the thigh, on or within the boundary line. Rules 5:15-1, 5:15-2, and 5:15-2A apply. In C, action will be stopped. Once the thigh slides across the boundary line, Wrestler A no longer has two supporting points on or inside of the boundary line. Any near fall points earned up to that point can be awarded. Situation 5. Wrestler A is held in a high bridge with his or her feet planted on the mat with both knees elevated inside of the boundary line. The head of Wrestler A is situated out of bounds. In A, Wrestler B is completely out of bounds. In B, while Wrestler B is still completely out of bounds, Wrestler A comes out of the high bridge with his or her shoulders touching the mat out of bounds. In C, while Wrestler B is still completely out of bounds, Wrestler A comes out of the high bridge and a portion of one scapula touches the boundary line. In D, Wrestler B is able to scoot his or her right thigh and left knee onto and or inside of the boundary line. Wrestler A, with feet and knees still inside of the boundary line, comes out of the high bridge such that his or her shoulders touch the mat out of bounds. Situation 5, rulings. In A, C, and D, wrestling continues and fall and near fall can be scored. In A, Wrestler A's feet are considered to be the two supporting points, 5:15-1. In C, the scapula touching the mat becomes all of the supporting points, 5:15-2. 2B. Since a portion of the scapula is touching the boundary line, two supporting points of wrestler A are in bounds. In D, while wrestler A's shoulders are touching the mat out of bounds, becoming all of the supporting points, which dictates that he or she is out of bounds, wrestler A has two supporting points on or inside of the boundary line, allowing wrestling to continue. Rules 5:15-2B, 5:15-1. In B, once wrestler A's shoulders touch the mat out of bounds, they become all the supporting points of wrestler A. Accordingly, the match is stopped and any near fall points earned up to that point can be awarded. Rule 5:15-2B. Thank you for viewing this virtual meeting. If you have any questions or comments, please do not hesitate to contact me or one of our state rules interpreters as follows. Have a safe and healthy holiday season.